that you've joined us. And we're very excited to share more with you today about the Resilience Fund for Women in Global Value Chains, which we will probably shorten to the fund or the Resilience Fund for the sake of the webinar today. My name's Yvonne Henry. I am the Brands Director at Women Win. Women Win is Global Women Fund, and we are proud to be a key partner on the Resilience Fund with the Universal Access Project at UN Foundation. So, why are we here today? We are here to share more about the Resilience Fund. So, in brief, just to kick us off, the Resilience Fund is a pooled corporate fund with 10 apparel sector investors, providing flexible, unrestricted funding to women led organizations that work in around global value chain communities. Our plan today is to provide you an overview of the fund itself, kind of how it operates, but also talk about the safe learning spaces that we have co-created that allow for multi-sector knowledge exchange and dialogue. And we want to explore then why these kind of spaces are crucial for any kind of robust human rights due diligence work that includes meaningful and effective stakeholder engagement. So that's the plan today. And who will you hear from? We'll kick off conversation with David here from the Universal Access Project at UN Foundation, and then we'll move through two panels. The first panel, you'll hear from one of the fund's grantee partners from Bangladesh, Sansida, and one of our strategic partners from India, Yashavini is here as well. And on panel two, David will chat to two of the Resilience Fund advisory board members, one who is a corporate investor, and then one from Women's Fund Asia. Anisha will be here. So Anisha and Gloria. And then we should have time for a Q&A. So that's the plan today. We will kick off with a kind of a brief overview of the fund, just to give you some context as we move through the panel conversations today. And I'm going to chat to David. Do you want to do a quick introduction?
Yeah, I'm David Wofford with the Universal Access Project of the UN Foundation, and we do a lot around women's health and empowerment. And we're a co-partner, multi-partner with on the Resilience Fund, and we share the same screen.
We're sharing the same screen today.
That's how close we are.
David, kick us off and tell us a little bit about the origin story of the fund itself.
Well, it happened during COVID. And you hear people talk about co-creation, but this really was co-created, that Women Win and BSR and UAP at the UN Foundation all came together with several companies and say, what do we do during this really terrible time? And there'd been a lot of emergency funding, but we thought we needed to do something different, something systemic, something that focused on women, recognizing that what was happening during COVID was not just a one-off thing. This was what was already going on. And we wanted to build on new approaches to philanthropy and community engagement that had been really pioneered and led by women's funds, that we weren't doing something completely new, but we were building it for a new space in corporate philanthropy. And this was really around what you heard in the video, trust-based, democratized governance structure and funding that we would do with corporate funders. We would give organizations longer-term flexible funding so they could do what needs to be done, trusting in women and their organizations to know what the communities needed rather than top-down approaches that said, here's what you need to do. And so one of the things, our purpose was to invest as women-led organizations, but with a focus on women's health, women's safety, and as these ties into the overall economic resilience of poor women in supply chains. But it's important to say these weren't the only focuses of these organizations. They work in many other areas. So we have supported about 65 organizations over the last 3.5 years. And since our launch in May 2021 in Southeast and South Asia, you should know we have a lot of diverse groups. So it's not simply in supply chains, but we have labor groups and groups that support labor. We have people in supply chain communities, groups focused on migration, folks in agricultural areas. And the idea is to have a whole portfolio that can speak to each other, that provides sort of diverse perspectives. The other thing we should just say is we have a very democratic governance structure. No corporate or non-corporate civil society or women's fund can say where the money goes. We do it collectively. And so there's really a power shift that's really important on how we do this. So you all may be asking, well, what's a fund have to do with due diligence and effective stakeholder engagement? And it's really a hub of learning, and learning is central. And I'm going to turn it over to Vani to say, so what are the things we do that sort of create this kind of learning and dialogue?
So we frame the fund as a hub of learning, like David has shared. So the focus on learning is core, and it has been from the very, very beginning. And a few of the objectives that we had with this learning approach, hub of learning, or you will hear learning hub today, is what we most commonly call it, is to create a safe, authentic, and inclusive space where all stakeholders can come together from the corporate sector, from the civil society, from the grantee partners. They could come together to connect, to share knowledge, to learn from each other. And the learning is two-way, it's reciprocal. So it's not meant to be extractive, it's meant to be inclusive. So all stakeholders can share with each other. So that's the first thing. The second thing was really it was an intentional way to flip the script on traditional monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and what that typically looks like in some contexts, which can be key performance indicators or log frames. So again, the focus is not on that, but more around generation of learning between groups. And then the third thing was around quick feedback loops. So when we sit together as stakeholders and have a conversation about, like we did recently, about just transition and climate change, the idea is to generate outputs and learnings that can come back to the group so that we can learn from them and apply them within our organizations. And I think the other key aspect here is about trying to rebalance the power between investors and between grantee partners. And we do that again through trying to create a safe, inclusive space where all voices are heard. A couple of other things that I will share is that learning is happening at all levels, which is why we call it a hub of learning. It's happening at the advisory board level between the diverse stakeholders on the board itself, within the investor group, where they can share challenges and context and knowledge with each other, and then also at grantee partner level. So there's a lot of peer-to-peer learning that happens at that level. And what we've created is this learning hub space where these stakeholders can come together in person and virtually. And what's important here is language justice. So offering, when we open up these spaces for all the stakeholders to connect, it's about, Hindi and Tamil and Bangla and Khmer, all of these different languages together. We look at disability justice. We also look at time justice, knowing that a lot of the stakeholders in these conversations are very, very global. So again, it's to ensure that these spaces are inclusive and that all voices are respected and heard. And then to bring it back to connect it back to what you just asked me, which is around how does this apply to human rights due diligence. So I think we see huge value in how these spaces can allow corporates to access real-time learning and on-the-ground knowledge and information. And I think we believe that this multi-sector dialogue complements the more maybe traditional linear due diligence methods and approaches. So ongoing dialogue in a safe space is critical, we think, for any due diligence that is truly assessing human rights risks and given that everything is changing so rapidly. So this becomes really, really important. So that is the link to the learning and the conversation today.
Oh, great.
Okay. Well, we won't go too much because we want to make sure that you listen to and can hear from the panelists themselves. So I think we'll leave it there, David, and maybe we will share another quick video. I think we have another quick video that kind of outlines the partnership model before we get to talk to Sansita and Yash on the first panel.
Learning hub that the Resilient Fund create, it is a place that we get connected, share the story, and learn from the other partner as well. I also learn from their culture, their background, their community, learning from their experience and also exchange my experience. So I love to connect with others grantees and build a network.
And so we are all working together and we're all addressing different aspects and pieces of it. We have to take this risk. We have to put ourselves in spaces which are uncomfortable to us.
It's been a lot of unlearning of my own unconscious biases and a lot of learning about how to be open and build partnerships with unlikely actors.
To be able to learn on the ground what's important to stakeholders that we didn't have visibility of previously. I think it's learning what you don't know. That's what's been the biggest learning to us.
The grantor also there, so they also shared their challenges, what they are facing, and the opportunities also. So in that way, I find that it is a good thing that we can connect the whole world, in fact.
Thank you. Well, I think I'll wait for the slide to come up, which can give you a bit more information. But in the meantime, we have Yash Azvini. Yash, I hope it's okay if I'll call you Yash. Yash is
No
the
problem.
founder and CEO of OxaHub. They've been a key partner of the fund since the very, very beginning. And they support with language justice learning and also offer ongoing strategic support in the fund. And we have Sansita, who you saw on the video there a second ago. Sansita is the additional executive director at Carmore GB Nari, one of the fund's grantee partners. So welcome both. Excited to have you today. I'll kick us off with the first question to Sansita. Sansita, what has been your experience with the fund in general, and what are some of the benefits for Carmore GB Nari? What have you gained from being involved in the fund?
Yeah, at the very beginning, I'll start from David, what he said during the fund started during or after COVID. In that time, we work with the women workers, especially ready-made garment workers. During COVID and after COVID, it was a huge uncertainty of the workers regarding their job and the wage cut and such issues. And in that time, we found that the gender-based violence issue was very prevalent, and workers do not get any support from law and order situation because all the people are running to the COVID mitigation and other things. So in that phase, we get the fund from Resilience Fund, funding for the Resilience Fund. And what is the beauty of this fund? It is philanthropic and non-restricted. We found the proposal during proposal submission. It was a very easy format, and after that, when we started our implementation, we found nothing is so much critical or formatted issues. So we can explain our experiences. We can give our own reports and field level information to that. So it is a new experience for us for such an unrestricted and fund. Another issue as there is a learning hub, we discussed already. There is a safe space to discuss or share our experiences with other partners like from other states like India and other, and we can learn from each other what they are doing. At the same time, we can hear from the grant makers and the corporates. And in many times we discuss in the breakout rooms, we share our what is happening in the ground. And that is the main important thing, I think. And in other discussions, we also can hear what is challenging they are facing to funding such unrestricted philanthropic funds. So I think it is a great opportunity for both us to create co-create such an environment for sharing our experiences, and of course the situation of workers who are working in the ready-made garment sectors in Bangladesh.
Supply chain. Thank you so much, Sansita. And actually, Yash, you've been part of these learning sessions and part of the Learning Hub since the start. And you've been in those spaces where grantee partners are coming together with investors. What are some of the insights that kind of have come out of those conversations that you feel it's good to share today? Building
Thank you,
on.
Yvonne. That's a big question, and I'm going to try and keep it as succinct as possible. I think that's one of those questions we can stretch to do an entire hour on just by ourselves. But fundamentally, we just heard from Sanjita about how these are spaces of knowledge exchange, right? And if we're looking at our two broad categories of stakeholders in the fund, which is your grantee partners and your corporate partners, there are some key themes that are emerging from our experience at OxoHub working in this space. For grantee partners, top three, first, I'd say peer learning. These are organizations with shared contexts, shared challenges, a reasonably shared systemic understanding of the community, of the problems at hand and how they're going about it. So we've seen conversations between grantee partners around how to navigate various institutions, about sharing training material, both in terms of people resources as well as written resources across various subjects. We've had sharing of funding opportunities that might be more relevant to a certain geography or a certain sector within the fund itself. So it's definitely very much grown into a space of peer learning. The second theme that has emerged, and very strongly so, is demystifying the funding process. So for a lot of the organizations in the fund, the access to speak to funders directly is very, very limited. And so when we have these platforms and spaces where we do have representation from corporate partners, to be able to ask questions around, after I submit my proposal, what happens? How do these decisions get made? On what grounds are these choices made? Has been very, very powerful. And finally, something that Sanzida touched upon as well is there is a certain appreciation for the expertise of grantee partners, and that's something that they definitely appreciate. We saw Tamanna on the video speaking to that as well, about how there is a respect that these are the people on the ground, these are the people who understand realities of what's happening in worker communities, what's happening in the factories. And with that is also a respect for limitations of bandwidth. We just heard about the application process. And so those would be from our conversations, the top three for grantee partners. For the funding partners, I think a big one is understanding of the contexts of the grantee partners, right? For many of our funder representatives, they're reasonably removed from the factory context or the worker community context. So to be able to listen directly from grantee partners about the messiness, the complexity, the multiple layers of what ground reality is like has been quite powerful. And the spaces that we were talking about has also helped overcome any language barriers or, say, communication barriers of what a website might have or what a grant proposal might have or a pitch deck might have. It's helped overcome some of those limitations with just direct face-to-face personal conversation. So largely themes around conversation, community, and learning from each other.
Amazing, amazing. And we were speaking a bit earlier, Yash, sorry to to go another direction, but it takes time, hey? And there have been challenges, I suppose, in creating these spaces. And maybe you can mention a couple of the ones we were speaking about earlier in terms of language. And it's good to be upfront and honest about.
It's also a question I wish people asked me more, because we often sometimes speak so much more about the things that are going well that we don't publicly acknowledge how much work has gone into it going well, I think. But yeah, it's definitely been not without its challenges. Building a community that's so driven by or so rooted in trust and respect definitely takes time. I think it's also important to acknowledge that this is almost entirely virtual. All of the grantee partners met once in person in June last year, but beyond that, for the last 3 years, we're all speaking to each other through a screen, and these are sensitive conversations, and given the kind of socio-political economic context of today, even more so. And so to build a level of trust with strangers on the internet definitely takes a certain amount of time. You add to this time zone differences, language differences, sector differences, and it only takes that much longer. Thanks to technology, language justice has gotten a little easier. We've been able to provide simultaneous interpretation across languages in all of our, virtual meetings. There were logistical challenges in terms of managing that in person, but I think we did rather well, and it's been fulfilling, if a little slow. But I think these things do take time, and I mean, I would caution strongly against trying to rush it.
Amazing. Thank you, Yash. And Zita, maybe I'll come back to you to build on something that Yash mentioned about around the corporate benefit from being in these spaces. So in what ways do you think the fund supports corporates to understand the issues facing workers in the supply chain communities and in the supply chains themselves?
I think it is a good strategy also to engage us in the process of the learning hub, especially I should say, because it is full of online based discussions. And when corporates can learn what is going on in the ground level, so I think it can help them to strategize their policy or their code of conduct in the value chain countries, what to be done, especially during the especially the gender-based violence issue that is prevalent in this sector. Many research shows that though it is a women based women en- engaged heavily in this sector. So the gender-based violence issue is prevalent, So this is a one thing. Another one is the climate change issue, what is happening in our countries, and the commitment by the corporates to go for limited carbon emissions. So these issues are also coming, and we are sharing that in our country also. How can we prepare? How can the worker get prepared to face the future of these climate change issues and the adoption or mitigative option that corporates are taking, like automation. Yeah, by these issues or green technology, how the women can prepare, how corporate can uh, do better for involving or retain the worker in their job by upskilling and other issues. So it is very much, I think it is very much good, and for us it is an opportunity to let the corporates about this issue, and that can help their future planning.
That access to real-time live
Yeah.
experience can complement some of the other processes, I suppose, that are happening within due diligence approaches within the corporate side. Yash, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm just going to put a reminder to folks to, if there's any questions, you can pop them in the Q&A, the little Q&A thing, or even in the chat if that's too hard. But it has to be in the Q&A. Has to be in the Q&A. Yash, I'm going to come back to you. For the last couple of months, you've been having conversations with the South Asia grantee partners, with all of them, actually, all 30, over
Something
30.
like that, late 20s, yes.
Great. What have you been hearing from them about how they view the spaces, the Learning Hub space, and yeah, what does it do for them? What has come out of some of those conversations?
So I think the overwhelming kind of response has been that the importance of a space like this has only grown in the last 3 odd years of the fund itself, given the social landscape, political landscape, funding landscape, and everything that's happening around us in these times. The ability to lean on this community and lean on this platform with recurrent, frequency has been something that has been deeply appreciated. What's kind of stood out and is very heartwarming for us is the kind of peer learning and networking that has grown in the last 3 years. We've had so many stories emerge of organizations reaching out to each other, either for material support. So we've had training manuals being exchanged, we've had resources being exchanged, we've had flyers and pamphlets and other sorts of awareness material being exchanged. We've had people reach out to each other to help conduct workshops, conduct, community mobilization sessions for each other's organizations. We've had people exchange playbooks because these are people who work in similar domains across different geographies. So if one organization has set up women's support centers in one part of the country or the one part of the subcontinent, and there's another organization looking to adopt a similar model in another part of the subcontinent, they've been able to reach out to each other and say, how have you navigated permissions? How have you navigated local government? How have you navigated stakeholder management and community building? And so these are the kind of detailed, nuanced conversations that have been happening completely independent of the formal structures of the fund, so to speak, right? Because it leans on relationships of trust and relationships of just good faith that have emerged between grantee partners. So that's one. The other thing is also, and this is something very close to my heart, but I think there has been growth in a sense of community, and this goes far beyond just a professional community. It's also become a support network for these organizations and leaders of these organizations. We saw this in person in Kathmandu, where we all met last year, but there's a sense of camaraderie, of leisure, of a little lightness and fun. And I think this is so important in this sector because you put all of these people in a room, and these are people who are doing really hard work, right? The problems that you're solving are sticky, the structures that you're working with are messy and complicated, and it can get overwhelming and it can feel lonely even at times. And so you now have this community of people who understand the messiness and understand the loneliness and can commiserate, but can also just make light of it. And there was so much feedback around how this sense of community kind of recharges your batteries and you go back feeling more energized to continue doing the work you're doing because we don't speak often about how hard it is to do this work. And it really, really is hard. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that within grantee partner spaces, there is trust, but there's also a lot of nuance. You spoke briefly about the conversations around just transition and climate change. We had some conversations around mental health in this sector, which is another subject that doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. And so there's the ability to exchange nuanced notes on a lot of these subjects that are not often spoken about in large platforms because there is so much common ground, right? So you're able to go past that common ground into nuance, into detail, into some of the more finer aspects of that conversation. And finally, flexible funding itself. I speak largely from an Indian and by extension, some amount of Bangladeshi context, but unrestricted flexible funding is not the norm. Domestic, definitely not the norm. And so for a lot of the organizations that are grantee partners, this has been a huge kind of a significantly important platform to tide through COVID, to tide over unexpected organizational shifts, build a certain sense of organizational resilience. And so just the ability to use this flexible funding, be trusted that they know how to use it best has been hugely empowering to many of our grantee partners. So
Amazing. Thank you, Yash, for bringing us back those learnings from all of your conversations. And it sounds like that sense of community will probably be needed more than ever as we're seeing some of the funding changes and shifts at the moment, and yeah, some of the challenges that groups are facing. And maybe I'll end with you, Sansita. What's the biggest challenge for Karmojibi Nari over the coming years? And yeah, what will
Thank you. Though we are a non-for-profit organization, every time we are in challenge for fundraising and sourcing, how can we get sustainable for our workers and sustainable our work for the workers. So the situation of funding is critical and going critical day by day. And though Bangladesh is going to like a middle income country, advancing from his right position, it is also very critical. Many funds are not coming to Bangladesh, especially the poverty-related education and something like that. So there, the NGOs or civil society are in a crisis. And recent development in USA, what we all know, that is also down the fund sizes, and Karmojibi Nari also affected from that decision. And it is a good feeling that during this crisis, we can know that resilience fund will give us more another one funding. This is I feel that just stand beside resilience fund to the Karmojibi Nari. And I think though we are in a non-for-profit, we know we have to face many things, but sometimes a non-restricted philanthropy fund like Resilient Fund gives us some space to breathe or plan what to do for the next challenge, to face the next challenge. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Sansita. Yeah, good note to end on, I think, in terms of like maybe leveraging this model to be able to influence more philanthropy and corporate philanthropy to be able to, yeah, do more unrestricted funding long term, which would be amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I want to see if there's any questions. I don't see anything come in yet, but if there's anyone wants to add, or we can move to the second panel, maybe and hold questions to the end. Shall we try that? Oh, I do see a Q&A. Oh, Kathy is asking, in which countries are you active? Great question, Kathy, that maybe I can answer. So the fund is currently active in India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And we are now moving into our 4th year of grant making, which will continue in these 4 key countries, quite linked to the supply chain of some of our investors. But yeah, very, very key markets. Great question. Oh, another one. Ooh, good question. What are the something Yash and I were talking about? So, what are the most unexpected use of funds you saw in the past 3 years? Great question. Yash, I don't know if you can share a bit from your conversations. We were talking about this a little bit earlier around what some of the grantee partners are using funding for. Sometimes mostly project expansion, reaching into more communities, different target groups. Some organizations are using it for core support for either building up the infrastructure of their organization. Um, some are using it for, yeah, we've had some partners who've had the unexpected passing away of very key staff within their organization over the last few years. So this core support allows them to be able to run a recruitment process, to be honest, and replace staff that are no longer with the organization, which is not always possible if you don't have access to core unrestricted funding. What else, Sansita and Yash, would you add to that?
I think not so much unexpected, but very often unrecognized cost centers have definitely been supported in terms of, I know of organizations that have been able to reimburse phone expenditure for their field teams and travel grants for staff who are traveling for learning, platforms, or field staff who are taking multiple modes of transportation to be able to travel to remote geographies. So those are very often line items in budgets that either fall through the cracks or are not considered core programmatic expenditure. So that has been helpful. You already spoke about key personnel, both in terms of salary-based unexpected costs, but also in some cases when key team members were lost to illness or just attrition and transition. It's definitely helped. I like the phrase that Sanjita Didi used in terms of just there's some breathing space. You're not immediately filled with a panic and needing to address the problem when you're already dealing with organizational instability in the short run. So yeah, not unexpected, but definitely not as common.
But for me, I can share one thing, not
Please.
allowed. Sometimes
Awesome.
restricted funds do not allow many things. This fund allowed us to plan as per our field level experience, especially in Bangladesh. We cannot do anything for the health issue, health support for the ready-made garment workers, but they are facing many problems, and their health SR related problem issues they are facing, and we cannot give anything. We can just award them, but this project we give the opportunity to support them the health supports by the doctors, by the medicines, and also sometimes operation and other big support. We cannot find any fund. So this type of restricted fund give us some release that we can do something for that directly to the workers. That is also very necessary sometimes.
Amazing. Sansita, thank you so much. Thank you, Yash. Thank you, folks. I think we'll move to our next panel.
Is there another question?
Oh, is there one more? We can hold it maybe till the end.
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, we can do that one at the end. Is that okay? Thank you, Kathy, again, and we'll definitely answer that at the end. And we move to the next panel. We'll hold that one. Yeah. Thank you, team. I will pass my screen over to David.
Just rolling back and forth. It's really pleased for our next panel. Slides will come up and they'll be up in a minute. I just want to add a few things here that our learning may be, it's both virtual, but we have 3 or 4 different ways we have asynchronous and synchronous learning. So there's this hub, what we do with our grantee partners, either individually, as a group, or with all our partners. We also have an investors group where they meet once or twice a year. And we also have these moments where people come together at major events, whether here in Paris for OECD, where we're inviting our corporate partners and other non-corporate partners and some of our grantees and others to have a bespoke kind of questions and discussions. And at other events. So there's multiple ways we learn from each other. And part of the point is this is kind of a portfolio. We are recognizing it's not just funding individual organizations, but the collective understanding and perspective, both near supply chains and far away. So I'm really pleased right now for our second panel to get the view of our women's funds representatives and a corporate representative to get their perspective on what this means for really understanding what's happening with stakeholders in the communities they serve or are related to. And so I'm really pleased that Gloria Schock, the executive director of the VF Foundation, is joining us, as well as Anissa Chug, who is the executive director of the Women's Fund Asia. Both of them have been with the fund from very early on and have a long perspective with what we try to do. I'd say the third place where we actually have very important discussions is on the advisory board, which is 50%, less than 50% corporate and other civil society and women's funds. So it's a very robust kind of place to be. And the value of this is you get a wide range of perspectives on all sorts of issues. We've had discussions about the challenges of reporting. We've had the challenges of how to think about heat and other stress and how companies are thinking about that in their supply chains. We've also talked about how companies think about long-term investing. And so we're going to get into some of those issues and what the value for corporates and for women's funds that are on the front end and the front lines of grassroots organizations, funding them to give them voice, and how that can sort of create a broader perspective. And I am waiting for both of them to come up, and I think they'll be up in a second. But I can talk about a few things that I think are really, really important about this fund. One of the things was the question of who are the corporates. We've had 10 brands that have invested in us, and you can see them on our website. And these are almost all apparel. They're major brands, and they have been. The fund wasn't originally thought to be an apparel brand, but because of COVID and the focus on women-led organizations, apparel brands stepped up and recognized this is a part of something they could do that would be new and different and engage in different ways. And the important thing to say about the corporate role here is, and I think you said this a little bit, was that Vani said this, is that no one sits and gets. When we have these discussions, there's no sort of sitting back and taking notes. We expect everyone on any kind of virtual or in-person gathering to really participate, to share what they can. And these are safe spaces, so we don't publicize them. We often take the learnings from everybody to share as insights, but we don't we don't at all give names or other things. And this is really important because what we have on this fund is an incredible array of perspectives. We have very strong-minded labor groups. We have some of the powerful women's leaders, but we also have others that are in reproductive health or in technology and others that provide sort of a very broad set of views and perspectives. So it's not ideological on any part of the spectrum. And I think that's really important that women's funds and grantee partners can learn the perspective of what the issues corporates are being faced with and vice versa. And it becomes very different from the one-off kinds of very important compliance around due diligence that happens all the time. And this, we would never suggest this is a replacement for this, but it's a much richer, real-time, ongoing engagement. And one of the things we have is a structure that sort of risk mitigates because no one's getting money directly from a brand and no brand is deciding where the money's going and vice versa. None of the women's groups or others are alone deciding where things go or what the priorities are. And it's a very unique approach to decision making and strategy and other things. So I am still wondering where our panelists are. Oh, they're there. I'm sorry. I've been talking and the screen wasn't there. So that was bad. But I will turn to Gloria. And I wanted to ask you, as I went on and on, I wanted to hear how you see the fund as being helpful to companies in providing new ways of engaging companies and stakeholders in supply chains, and hear your perspective from what I gave an overview of and what's correct and where you see it from your perspective.
Well, thanks for bringing us into the fold, David. And it's just a privilege to be able to share this space and have this conversation today. So, business can play a powerful role in helping to address some of society's greatest challenges. And by leveraging our collective scale and our resources as a force for good, and with a shared North Star, we can better serve the communities where we operate in a rapidly changing world. And, I think for companies that have extensive supply chains, it's not often that you have the opportunity to connect directly with nonprofits on the ground, and to be able to garner the insights with those organizations that are working directly in our supply chain. And, the fund helps us understand firsthand women's needs and how we can best support communities where they can operate as those agents of change in their own communities in a way that one company could never do on its own. And the fund has been a valuable experience for me to better understand what garment workers and grassroots organizations are facing day to day in their respective communities. And I'd say too that just the Learning Hub model truly has created a meaningful opportunity for deeper connection, deeper dialogue, and collaboration. And I know you mentioned, David, this component of real-time learning among the corporate investors, the global women's funds, as well as the grassroots organizations. And it's really layered in ways that would not be possible outside of the fund.
Yeah, and it's funny, Laura, you were the one that got us to, we get a lot of real-time information through WhatsApp from them, and we've started collecting them and putting them in regular newsletters as well. So there's multiple ways, and you were the driver of all the different ways we can get information. Anisha, from your perspective, I want to ask you the same thing. Why do you see it's important for companies to engage with these diverse groups and women organizations? And why do you think they need to invest through a fund like this mechanism? Why is that important? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks, David, and hi, everyone. I think before I answer, I quickly also just wanted to introduce WFA. It's a women's fund, and more importantly, I just wanted to state our mandate in the current context. We support groups and activists which are advancing rights of women, girls, trans, and intersex persons. I think in the current context, we really need to name our communities and stand by them even more. So, I really want to pick up on the statement that that Kalyani's opening statement in the video, and that was, if we want systemic change, we need all players. Again, in the world that we're living in, cross-sectoral collaboration and partnership has become even more critical. And we all cannot exist in silos. Investing in civic, socio-economic progress should be a mandate for everyone, not just activists or groups. Gender equality is everyone's agenda, and not just the women's rights activists or the civil society groups, right? So the private sector cannot survive in a vacuum, and neither can civil society organizations. And I also think that we have wasted too much time on listing reasons why we cannot collaborate, rather than focusing on how we can partner and figure out and strategize around it. And I think Resilience Fund is a perfect example of, you had various stakeholders across different sectors coming together with a shared vision, and then deciding that this is the journey we want to continue on, and then figuring that out along the way. So I think in this way, the world is shrinking. It's becoming smaller. Gloria just mentioned, right? Like it is important for the companies. You have supply chains. Your head office can be in New York or London, but your supply chain, where your factories and workers are in a different part of the world, right? And it impacts communities, it impacts people on the ground. So it is at the end of the day also about people. So I think investing and standing by the communities is extremely important in that context.
Yeah, I mean, it's been such an interesting journey for everybody I know, and I guess, Gloria, I'm just curious, what are the kinds of, how do you think this kind of dialogue, because it's not a typical kind of community engagement, it's very different, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the richness of sort of you're not going in just to speak with workers, and that's hugely important, but you have this relationship that's multi-year. I'm just curious, how you think this contributes to a company's, engagement with stakeholders in a different way?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. I'd say the fund can be a meaningful and complementary approach to the traditional corporate due diligence practices. And that traditional approach, where we're gathering data and information as parts of, for instance, needs assessments from workers and organizations for that due diligence is a snapshot in time. And while this is essential and important as a practice, the approach can often be more linear and in some cases more time consuming for workers and community organizations as they participate in these kind of one-off interventions. And the fund is an opportunity to really foster that meaningful engagement in a collective environment that really does garner rich qualitative data with, what was talked about earlier, this kind of two-way dialogue and generative conversation that we can have with NGOs and those grassroots organizations that are directly supporting apparel worker communities in our corporate supply chains by really being able to get that direct line of sight on their lived experiences and being able to share together. And I just say too that, rather than companies having to reach out to each of these organizations individually to garner that ongoing stakeholder input, this pooled funding approach also provides the opportunity as a collective to provide those valuable insights to participating companies in real time, and really understand the challenges that are being faced on the ground in this rapidly changing world. And I, will say too, that flexible funding piece for these organizations can be incredibly powerful, as we were hearing earlier in regards to being able to pivot quickly and be able to leverage funding when and where it's needed most in a way that we wouldn't have known if we weren't part of this dialogue. And I really do think it's a unique platform in regards to how we can address and solve issues that are important to our garment worker communities and so that they can show up better as their whole selves and fully actualized in their jobs as caregivers, as community leaders, and as workers as well.
It's interesting you say that because Anisha, one of the things we've learned from you is, you can't just give some money and run, that you have to have deep involvement with organizations. And the structure of this fund is unique in risk pooling and other things. From a women's funds perspective, why is it important for you to engage in this way? What's the value of a fund this is a very tough time. There's a lot of pushback around the world. And, it's an important time to engage. And I'm just love to hear you articulate all the lessons and things that are important for why this is a structure that really can work in a very difficult time.
So, as a women's fund and as other feminist funds, our mandate is to provide flexible, sustainable funding for our partners on the ground. And like you mentioned, this task has become harder in the current context where you're just hearing funding cuts, funding cuts, funding cuts. We recently did a survey, and the survey is still ongoing of our partners, around 300 plus partners, to figure out how they're doing in terms of their funding health. And it was really, really alarming to know that for many of them, either WFA is the only funder or one of the two funders they may have. Many of them have basically said that if WFA or their other funder stops funding them, they might have to shut down their organizations. So in this context, as I said earlier, we cannot continue to just work in a vacuum or preach to the choir, speak to the choir, whatever the phrase is. We need to step out of our comfort zones, and we really need to focus on building allies, on growing the tribe, on forcing ourselves to be in a place where we really have those meaningful conversations, and being part of the Resilience Fund. One thing that I've really come to appreciate, how space is being created to have meaningful dialogue in a constructive manner. We have a lot of disagreements, but those disagreements are managed, are negotiated, and everyone's expertise and experience is acknowledged and valued. And I think that is very, very critical, because sometimes we just stop listening to one another. and that listening, those conversations have also resulted in like good tension. I do think that is very, very important. We have those uncomfortable conversations because they're necessary to move forward. And I think that's what we've been able to do at the Resilience Fund. And, you know, there was someone who mentioned in the video about trust. Generally, if you look at, say, and I'm speaking generally, I'm not, it's not like specifically, but generally civil society groups are very and do not trust corporates, right? And vice versa, right? So it's the same. There is not enough trust. How do you build that? Right? How do you go beyond your comfort zone? How do you go beyond your when the voices you're used to listening to, the language you're used to speaking? How do you unlearn and then learn back again to have those conversations? So I think in that way, this has been an incredible space for us to have those learnings and really, really address our mandate, which is to bring in diverse funding for the groups and collectives on the ground.
That's great. Gloria, do you thoughts on that from your perspective?
You know, I would just say in regards to the learnings, they've been multifold. There's been so many learnings from our engagement with the fund, and particularly the on-the-ground insights from participating with global funds and those grassroots partners. And I think what's been really valuable is being able to stretch our perspectives and challenge our assumptions within our own silos. And the Learning Hub has provided that unique kind of firsthand insight on how we can best support the communities in their own backyards, and has provided the opportunity, I'd say, too, on the corporate side, to build deeper relationships that have been helpful as we advance our community impact work together and sharing best practices with each other. I think we get so busy with our jobs and our day-to-day work, and it really does provide the opportunity for us to kind of have these deeper conversations on how we advance this work together. And I'd say too, it's reinforced for me that kind of true systems change in the communities where companies operate cannot be done overnight. I mean, has become very clear, and it's not something that can be done alone. And that it truly takes, as you were mentioning, David, that long-term commitment, that long-term engagement, that long-term investment of resources to build that community trust and work together towards progress on improving and bettering lives within our supply chain communities. And I would say too, it has provided greater understanding just from the learnings from just the best practices of global women's funds on how you lead with trust-based philanthropy in meaningful ways, and is the way that the global funds have been operating for years. So that's been incredibly insightful. It's also reinforced for me the powerful intersection of both people and planet that we all know as we continue to support supply chain communities where they operate. You know, when we think about these growing issues and stressors around heat islands and flooding affecting communities in the global south, and the tremendous toll that it takes on those supply chain communities, on their work and their health and their economic well-being, I think it's really a stark reminder on the importance of taking a human-centered and taking these kind of innovative new approaches on how we can support organizations on the ground to build more resilient communities, and supporting those local organizations who are in the front lines of experiencing these challenges to help us with future mitigation planning as well.
So we are close to our time. It's been incredible. We have a couple questions. I don't know if we can get to them completely, but Vani, why don't you come in this and you can we have a couple questions here.
Can we answer Kathy's
We've already
question?
done that. And we will send people the answers to your questions too offline. But one is just questioning about the Learning Hub, and does any of the feedback or challenges and complaints come from grantees? And if yes, how have the participating funders or corporates incorporated those into their due diligence process? I'm not sure we can answer that quite a linear piece here. And so, Gloria, I don't know if I'll put you on the spot on that one, but it's a wondering where the feedback loop is essentially when you learn things. And So
maybe corporate foundation side.
Yeah, I mean, I can say, being on the foundation side of our organization, we work, very closely in partnership with our business. And so being able to kind of cross exchange that dialogue, the learnings with our teams has been very helpful as they continue to do their work on the ground as well within the supply chain, and actually getting us on the same page on kind of what are the issues and kind of how we can best address them together.
right. And we have two other questions, and one is about the pandemic and what plans for the next ones. And we do think that the Resilience Fund is a way to create resilience. So it's not just from one pandemic, it's a whole approach. So I'm going to quickly go on to the next question. Talking about the context of AI developments, which will change job profiles, and assuming additional knowledge and accessible to the poorest people in countries, low qualified people, and less trained categories and genders. Which is the approach, and does it exist? Does there exist a resilience plan for it? I don't know if I've asked the question right, but Anisha, you can see the question online. Do you have a quick response to that? You've been thinking a lot about this. Trying to read it.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just reading. I'm really
Not
not clear what exactly is the question.
I think they might be asking about like the developments in AI and tech, which will probably change the skill set or for folks in the future. But yeah, maybe I don't understand that. Which is the approach, and does it exist a resilience plan for? We have been talking about just transition from a climate perspective, but it has come up about just transition from an AI and tech perspective as well.
I mean, I'm happy to reflect quickly on just some of the, not maybe AI and tech perspective, kind of, but for example, in the last few years, just the impact on labor, right? Like the gig economy has boomed. And even those of us who've been working on labor rights, we've not taken into account the human cost of a gig economy, in terms of what impact it has on workers on the ground. When you say guarantee, say 5-minute deliveries, what is the payment, the kind of wages many of them are being paid. So that is rapidly changing, right? Like everything is available to us now on our apps, but there is a whole human cost to it. And we are seeing that alarmingly across, especially in the global south. And in our labor portfolio, we're actually trying to see how we can now bring in gig economy workers and work with them. We have experience in working with, say, garment factory workers, looking at unorganized sector, domestic workers, agricultural laborers. But this entire boom of gig economy definitely took some of us by surprise in terms of, hey, we haven't addressed this entire sector of workers who've actually just fallen through the cracks.
Well,
and
it's a huge issue that we hope our fund is a part of thinking through collectively and in peer groups. I want to thank Anisha especially for being late at night, joining us, and Gloria from Denver, Colorado. The rest of us are in Paris, and we're happy to talk more about this either in person or online or any other mode of communication. But I think the one thing to close on is we don't treat this fund as sort of a final model that we have all the answers. What has made this exciting is that all of us collectively are trying to figure out, how do you do these things? How do you have these conversations? How do you have them in person, virtually, and other kinds of means to really understand in new ways what are the issues facing workers, not just in a one-off moment of trying to get due diligence, which is no doubt important. There's no bad mouthing of that, but really, how do you have a long-term relationship that's non-extractive? So we hope some of you will join us on that journey. And I want to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar, and particularly our panelists who are so great today. So have a great evening or a day, and we hope to hear from you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Bye.
Thank you, Anisha. Bye, Gloria.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Bonnie. Great seeing you, Anisha.
Bye.
Bye.